needed, I I've been doing it even before.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to call us to order.
I know, I can use those too as well. Bye.
Would the deacons come to order, please? My God, the riffraff that they hire as deacons. Actually, you know, I was at an Orthodox service a while ago, and the job of the deacon is to come out occasionally and say, attend! Yes. And actually, Craig can be chatting until then, and then you have to pay attention for a bit. So, I'll give you that job next week. Okay. Well, welcome again, everybody. A couple of things to just start us off. This room is still not finished, and I gather it's less finished this week than it was last week. So, I don't know how that happens. We want to, of course, begin by acknowledging we're on Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation, and give thanks for our privilege of living and working and having our being on this land. A slight change to procedure. We're going to, and I'm having to keep time, we're going to stop for a break at 10 to 8, and you will come back at 8. That means you could go down and get a coffee downstairs before the cafeteria closes at 8. Or there may be other things you may wish to do downstairs which we don't need to discuss. But so there will be a 10-minute break beginning at 10 to 8, and we'll start that way. The next little question I need to ask, is there anybody who is new this week, now you have to confess, new this week and doesn't have the package other than Fred Ford?
I think I have.
You could share it. Yeah, you could share it.
Yes.
Yeah. He's probably going to ask for a discount. We don't fool around here. Yeah. Anybody else?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. You're on.
So today we're going to be, I think according to the syllabus, we'll be talking about, if I remember correctly, today we're going to be doing early contact, the fur trade, and the royal proclamation. So Chris is going to do the more
boring bit.
the more interesting ones. I hurt his feelings last week. I don't know what to do about that.
Then you failed the pastoral care course.
No, actually, he's very good.
So that's what we're going to do first, and then we are going to, after our break, we're going to continue on where we left off with the sharing part. So we're going to do 3 this time with people who didn't share. So let's continue on that basis with people who didn't share. Or maybe we'll go, no, we can't do that. And then, then we're going to have your sharing theological time. So I guess we'll break into...
We'll work that.
Yeah, he'll work that out. Okay. It was interesting when I was here, gosh, many years ago, 30 years ago, 32 years ago. Wow. I was first here at the university, and I was taking Canadian Studies courses from Fred Shore. And I was remembering all of this stuff, and it was like going back to, and all of a sudden all of these things just come routinely back again, right? And the very first thing that I remember him saying was that, that really just kind of struck me was the fact that he had said that the forests, or the bush, came after the white man, which I thought was quite fascinating, because I had always thought that this place was always had trees, always had bushes that people had to clear, and the land had to be cleared away, right? And according to him, and some studies, I guess, that had been done at that time, that really wasn't the case. That really there was very vast open spaces because at that time, the Indigenous people had been cultivating and burning the grasses and doing all kinds of other things that promoted that. And the fact also that this past while I've been reading quite a bit on the civilizations that were here before contact. That in St. Louis, Missouri, for example, that city is built on top of an Aboriginal settlement. And that there were hundreds of there were thousands of people within that settlement, right? And so these people would have had agricultural practices that they did, and would have had all laws and everything else that was in place that is needed to live within society. But there was also places within the Great Lakes, south of the Great Lakes, that had these kinds of settlements, city-like places. And so I thought, wow, this is quite interesting. And someone had said, I'm not quite sure, I need to do more research on this one, but I read somewhere as well that in the Moose Jaw area, there was also one there. And so, but there were some other ones that had disappeared because of things like Ice Age, little Ice Age they had, and then there were sicknesses, and then so some of them places were abandoned. And but then new settlements arrived all over the place. It is estimated that there were, according to some people, in Canada there must have been like 2 million people or more. But in all of North America, Chris may be able to correct me on this, it's estimated that there were 40 million people. And that was, something that continually decreased and decreased and decreased because of colonial expansion, illnesses being brought to North America, and so on. And so
I think I can give you a really good example, just to give you an idea. In Cumberland Sound, where I work now, this is on Baffin Island, so the population is going to be much smaller. In 1839, we know there were around 1,250 people in Cumberland Sound. I know that doesn't sound like very many, but that's quite a few. By 1890, there were 280. And only in 2001 did the population reach 1,250 again. So that just shows you and actually what that doesn't tell you is that all of the Inuit in South Baffin Island moved into Cumberland Sound. And so, in fact, the death toll was even higher, but it was not just the folks in Cumberland Sound, but also all the folks in South Baffin Island. So what Vince is talking about is an 80 to 90% reduction of the population. Horrifying.
yeah, and a lot of it happened because of the expansion of the Europeans moving inward, and so that there were not that many people left. I think currently we're not quite up to 1 million people yet when it comes to the Indigenous population. And of that, we are only 3% of the population in Canada. So where we've had 2 to 3 million people before, that went down to 400,000, I believe was the figure. And now it's slowly rising again. Actually, it's not slowly rising, it's greatly rising. And because Europeans are not breeding anymore, and maybe people are. Should I put it that way, or should I be more delicate? It's an Anglican course, so I guess we shouldn't be that delicate. But I found it quite interesting in how, one of the things that I really find quite fascinating, especially having done research for this course, is how the early contact, how the missionaries saw Indigenous peoples. More specifically, how Anglican missionaries saw Indigenous peoples. Here we had this great culture that was very deep, very profound in all of us, including the Inuit and the First Nations people, because the Métis people came much later. And so there are quite a number of references by John West, who had, as you probably know, the first missionary in this part of Canada, first Anglican missionary. And but we will be talking a little bit more about this later on. So it talks about he had met some Inuit people to begin with, and I think it's this one. It says, okay, the tribe appeared well conditioned in their savage life and remarkably healthy. And then as they were sailing away, he wrote, we soon parted with this barbarous people. So he had met these Inuit people who were very much laughing, very jovial people. And according to him, were quite clean and very much trading with the factors and the fur traders, and they left, right? And his reaction was that they were barbarous, that they were remarkably healthy. I'm not quite sure what he was expecting, but that was the very beginning of what he had understood to be the norm of Indigenous people. And then he went to York Factory. This was on his way down before he even came to this part of the country. And so he was at York Factory, and he said, I sooner landed at the factory and seen several Indian families crowded together in miserable-looking tents. Then I felt a lively interest as I anticipated in their behalf. These Cree presented a well-worn countenance which depicted suffering without comfort while they sunk without hope. I felt incumbent upon me to ameliorate their sad condition as degraded, emaciated, and wandering in ignorance and wearing away a short existence in one continued succession of difficulties in procuring food. I was told of difficulties, and some spoke of impossibilities in the way of teaching them Christianity, or the first rudiments of settlement and civilized life. So, and it goes on and on and on, and John West talks about how throughout his travels, this is exactly what he sees. He sees these Indians whose countenance were very poor and worn and sad, which was quite different from what I've experienced in my life, and the elders who have talked to me about the different life that we have had. While, certainly before contact, there was famines and there was hardships. It certainly wasn't where you would just sit with your face drooped down, right, in your weird and terrible looking tent and just sitting there anticipating death, right? There was so much more than that, but he talks about how this is the condition of the Indigenous people in this land. And so his thing, he says, to alleviate all of that is to bring the light of Christianity and civilization to these poor, barbarous people. So the mind frame of that time was exactly that. Now, you and I can sit and just kind of go, that is terrible, that's not good, right? But at that time, this was their way of thinking. The European way of thinking was that if you weren't a Christian, and if you weren't in a settled agricultural-based economy, that you were pagan, and that you were living in an enlightened state. And so that's what was brought here. And so they thought that because this is what they saw, there was no agriculture, basically, that they weren't living in wood houses, that they were without light, without truth, and that they were living a life of barbarianism and debauchery. Right? Even though the people who were, I suppose they were the fur traders and the people who were living in the forts, did not exactly promote the Christian ideals of the time, right? And the native people saw this. And there have been a number of even other missionaries who wrote of that account, that here are indigenous people who were telling them the gospel, and yet our people are not living it, which I thought was quite interesting. So they also talk about he talks about a little bit about what the indigenous people used to believe in. And I think a lot of it is kind of his own sense of what is going on here. He talks about how native people would pray to these and appease this evil god, not the Great Spirit, but this other one. So there were two fighting opposition spirits. One was the Great Spirit and one was an evil spirit, right? But he equated them as being both powerful together, right? As each other. I guess kind of like a yin and a yang kind of thing. And how native people would then try and appease this Machimanito, this bad spirit, this bad god, in order so that they would have a good health, good life, good hunting, and all of these other stuff. And whereas native people, and that a lot of this was worshipped, that native people had worshipped these beings, and that they had a form of animism about them. And I really do believe that there must have been some tribes who did, but when I was growing up and learning from my elders, there really wasn't that sense. The sense was that there was only one God, and that this bad spirit was not the same as, nor was the spirit greater than the Creator. Rather, it was a being that was subordinate to Kichimanito, the Great Spirit. Right? And that native people never, except that I think Ellen Cook would say that they did worship, they did have some form of animism where she was from. But and I think that's the only case where I've heard that was going on. But within the Cree traditions and the Cree culture, there was not any of that. And because if you worshipped anyone other than the Great Spirit, you were committing something that wasn't good. Right? And so there was one God, although this God did not have a name, but Creator, or this God was also known as the mysterious one, right? Someone that was way above you, and that you got to know. Right? There's a saying. We say "mamaskat" when we don't understand something. We just kind of close our eyes and we say "mamaskat" because we just don't get it. We don't understand it. And so that's the expression that a lot of indigenous people would have or would have had of God. And so, and the other thing was that there really was no religion, according to this guy, and that they did whatever it is that they wanted to do. And the reason for that would have been that each of us, or each individual, just very much today, like we as Christians, have our own spirituality. We have our own walk with Creator, right? We have our own way of communicating. We even have our own way of addressing. Some of us would call our Creator He. Some of us would call our Creator she. And so it is an individual thing. And it was always an individual thing. And then there was this thing called Minupimatisuen, which means the good road. And so people would walk this good road with Creator in the presence of creation, in the presence of community, and in the presence of family. So all of this would come together and be a part of this existence. The Ojibways would call this place Mother Earth. Crees, we don't have that concept. We call this place our Aski. So everything that is here, so this is our Aski. So everything, I think I said this last time, did I? Everything that you see here is part of our Aski. So the air we breathe, the plants, the flowers, the buildings, the people, the things on the earth, the bugs and the things under the earth are all part of this Aski. And so we live, Indigenous people live in that. And there's a connection, a deep connection to that, which has always been. And something that we have been taught, even as little kids, we have been taught to respect the earth, that we are not to harm, poison, or even spit on it. Like in Norway House, I don't know about other places, but in Norway House, if a person spits on the earth, that is considered very disgusting. That because what you're doing is you're putting your own grossness into the ground, right, as it were, and you're repelling something that shouldn't be taken to the earth. Right? If it comes out the other way, that's fine because it went through a process, I suppose, but I don't know. But those kinds of things. So that was at the very beginning of the interaction between missionary people and Indigenous people. And there's so much more that we can talk about and say about all of that. It is actually its own course in spirituality. And it is very deep spirituality that my people have always had. And so, but that was one thing that was never acknowledged by these early contact missionaries. It was always savage. You're going to hell. You're in total darkness until you become a Christian. And equated with that was you become civilized by settling down, living in a house, planting a garden outside your place, right? And living in that kind of community where you earn money and you contribute to the rest of the community, which is what Indigenous people were doing anyway to begin with. Right? And the fact that our people would say that Creator is the same Creator spoken of in Scripture, and that this is the same person, even though it did not have a name, but now it does, and the name is Jesus Christ. So for a lot of Indigenous people, there is that sense that everything remains the same. The only thing that changed was that the name came, right? And the gospel, of course, came. My grandfather, I think I said this before too, my grandfather, when he became a Christian, after going to residential school and to the United Church, moved away from and became an Anglican, but wasn't a Christian, but at some point had to figure out, right, had to figure out whether or not what they taught him in the residential schools was the truth, the verbal teaching, as opposed to the, this is, right, they didn't, the native people, the missionaries at the time wouldn't necessarily have lived out that gospel. He had to learn that. And so when he became a Christian, he would say that he became more indigenous. Because then he saw his personhood. He also saw the culture, the traditions, the ceremonies, the values of indigenous people, right, shining forth from Scripture. And so he would go, wow, right? And so it becomes, for him, it became something that was affirming and very much a part of who he was already as an indigenous person. So, I mean, there's also all kinds of things. I mean, Native people had trade routes from here to the East Coast to all the way down to South America, where there have been potteries that were sent here. There was also a village at the Forks. I don't know, when they dug up the Human Rights Museum, they found all kinds of seeds from everywhere. They even found tomato seeds. And so they figured out that there was a farming community at the Forks. And the Forks was also a place where people would gather. And it was like the Old Testament cities of refuge kind of thing, right? Where you could come there and you would be in peace, you would be safe. And so you could become a part of that community there for a bit and trade, and then you could leave without any kind of harm or whatever. So they had those kinds of places as well. And the economy that was here before the fur trade economy, which Chris will talk about, was vast and very much a part of even the South American part of the world. So,
Not going to disagree. Well, I think the point to pick up from what Vince is saying is that the European, and we'll have to come back to this in the second half, the Europeans in arriving here had a very particular understanding, and I want to say this takes us directly into what's called the doctrine of discovery. Okay, because it relates to precisely what Vince was saying. We'll flesh out the details, but in the simplest form, the doctrine of discovery is the notion, the European notion, that if you come across any uninhabited lands, then you can stake a claim on it on behalf of the country you come from. That's the principle what it is. The qualifying phrase in there is uninhabited lands, and that's what requires all the mental work that Vince just went through. Because and it actually, incidentally, it still exists in the way our law operates. That people who are not settled in particular areas, therefore they don't inhabit the land. If they don't actually transform the land by farming it, you don't inhabit it. Okay, and so people like the Cree in northern Manitoba, who, well, they actually were transforming the land, which is the point that Vince made, that the Europeans didn't recognize it. They couldn't possibly have any kind of ownership of that land, and therefore they didn't actually inhabit it. It gets a little more complicated when you're on the East Coast, and you actually have agricultural communities on the East Coast, according to showing you the various peoples down the East Coast. And the issue there becomes, well, okay, we've got settled communities and agricultural, the people are transforming the land, so therefore it would logically seem to you that therefore they must in some ways inhabit the land and the land is inhabited. But the logic is far more perverse than that, because they don't, of course, inhabit the land in the way that we think they should inhabit that land. And so one of the problems, and this is there's a wonderful irony in the literature. One of the problems, of course, is that I shouldn't say of course, is that the women did all the work all the agricultural work on the land, and the men spent their time gadding about hunting. Now, of course, this is an entire, very elaborate, sophisticated economy, but that is essentially it. And you find in the early literature that the commentary of them saying, who do these men think they are? Do they think they're princes or kings or something? Because in Europe, the only people who have the right and who legally could hunt were the royalty. They had reserved forests, they had reserved lands. All the game was reserved for the royalty, so only royalty were allowed to hunt. And here were this bunch of guys who were clearly not doing any work because the women were doing all the work, and they were running around doing only what royalty were doing. So there's a lovely irony in that early literature that talks about the fact that these guys were acting as if they were royalty. And you'll find in the literature that they're often referred to as kings and princes and that kind of terminology because of that connection. Okay? So what is underlying this idea is the notion that you are allowed to appropriate uninhabited land. Okay? And maybe to come into what's uninhabited. There's other technical problem which Vince pointed to, which we need to just get our head around very quickly, and that is in this depopulation that took place largely from disease. The hard part is that we are now aware that very early on, and probably prior to Columbus wandering into this half of the hemisphere, the Basque fishermen and other fishermen from Europe had discovered the fishing grounds along the eastern coast of North America, and they'd actually been operating there for quite a long time. All right. In fact, there is some evidence now, mainly from such exciting things as bills of lading and tax forms, that Columbus was actually working off the information from the fishermen who've been operating the coast. So incredibly early on, you have people working the coast and introducing diseases. So long before there's any actual settlement, the diseases are being introduced. And of course, these are diseases from Europe that have largely come into the human population by our close interaction with domestic animals. That's how most of these diseases come into the human population, which has not happened in this part of the world. So they're completely new diseases. And they are absolutely devastating. And to some extent, one of the problems when we deal with this very early history is, in fact, a lot of the areas that had been inhabited heavily at the time of the explorers and discoverers, the people who were actually planting the flags arrived, they've become depopulated. Now we know, for example, that when Jacques Cartier shows up in 1534 in Canada, when he shows up, the first thing that happens when he encounters the First Nations in the Cascade Peninsula there is the first thing they do is they hide the women in the bush, and the second thing they do is they come out with goods to trade. So it's clear that they already had some encounters with Europeans, and they knew what European men were on about. Okay? And so that even in what we record in Canadian history as the first encounters are not first encounters. They're much later. We also run into a couple of interesting problems and this takes us right into the heart of it. Of course, most of the east coast of Canada, or at least the St. Lawrence Valley, and Newfoundland is a slightly different history, was first encountered through the French. Further south, of course, the English are further south in what's now New England, well, what our concern is New England. You probably know the story of the Pilgrim Fathers. I'm not going to go into that story. But you have to remember that, of course, that's a group of Puritans who are leaving England because of, shall we say politely, a series of disputes in the Church of England, as
Which never
Dermot
happens nowadays.
No, as Dermot McCulloch reminds us, actually it's kind of an interesting thing that people tend to forget. The Puritans were Anglicans. They just didn't agree with the Anglicans who were in power. And that, of course, is the problem. The Puritans came to create their own heavens on earth. They came to create settled communities. And so they are in immediate conflict with the First Nations, because they have to move the First Nations out of the way in order to settle the communities. I also just want to throw a little theology at you to think about, first of all. They're also Congregationalists. And congregations are the gathered people of God who call and minister to them. They don't have a theology of mission. They don't have a theology of outreach and mission. So in the Puritan areas, there is virtually no attempt to missionize the indigenous peoples. They're not interested in it. Okay? They just need to move these people out of the way so they can settle and create God's heaven on earth. Okay? Just a little interesting side thing on that. Of course, what happens in British history, as you know, is at a certain point, the Puritans take over and control Parliament. They chop off a certain king's head, and they control Parliament. So all of a sudden, the folks who are running England are the same people who are sitting in New England. And the folks in England start taking a very sudden and great interest in what's going on in New England. One of the things that Parliament decides is that they should start missionizing these settlers. So they take up a collection. And in fact, one Sunday, the entire collection for the entire realm of England is taken together into one big pot and sent to New England to establish a school to create missionaries to the indigenous peoples, because the congregations weren't doing that. That school is called Harvard University. The first indigenous person went to Harvard University 234 years after it was founded. So it never, I have to be careful how I say this, because St. John's might slide into some of this as well. It never fulfilled the obligation that was created for it by British Parliament. So in that context, you don't see missionary outreach. All right? The French context is different. Now, just a quick question. What religion were these French folks who came over to Canada?
Roman Catholic.
No. These not. They were Huguenots. They were Huguenots. They all came from the Huguenot courts in France. Now, who are the Huguenots? Somebody who knows their history better than me. Who are the Huguenots? French Calvinists, French Protestants. Okay, they're the French Protestants. They're the ones who actually came over and started, because they were actually the trading. They were running the trade organizations. Now, the French crown pulled a trick on the Huguenots, which is actually one that the Anglican Church later pulled on the Presbyterians here in Winnipeg, is that they would not allow any Huguenot ministers to come over. They would only permit Roman Catholic priests to come over. So if you no longer have any ministers and you only have Roman Catholic priests, over time everybody ends up Roman Catholic, whether you want it or not. Okay? But, two things. The Huguenots were interested in the fur trade, which we'll come back to in a second. They were interested in the fur trade. They were not interested in this religion business. The crown imposed it on them. The crown imposed that they have to accept the missionaries, and they imposed that the missionaries have to try and convert the First Nations. Okay? So this is where we get into the state-crown relationship. And that's where that comes from. This is kind of an interesting story. We're going to talk a little bit about the fur trade in a second. Does anybody know what the second largest export from New France was? That's his one.
Salt.
Nope.
Timber.
Ginseng.
Oh,
Yes. Oh.
interesting.
And do you know why? Because we're talking about a bunch of Jesuits, and the Jesuits are in China, and they discover in China the healing properties of ginseng, and they write about it in their journals, and they draw pictures of ginseng. The Jesuits in New France read these books, because they distribute these books, they read them, and they say, oh my goodness, that plant grows wild here, and the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, are harvesting it, and they're using it for healing properties. So what we do is we harvest the ginseng in New France, we
Ship it over to China.
ship it over to China and sell it to the Chinese.
That's how they did it.
So, two things in that are really important, I mean, other than, ginseng. Two things in that are really important. One is you're dealing with an international trade operation, and you have to remember this is tied into an international trade operation. And secondly, you're dealing with the Jesuits, okay? And the Jesuits had quite a distinct approach to missions, all right? So, the part of what happens in that is you want to build alliance relationships. You want to build relationships with the First Nations because you want to be trading partners. And one of the best ways to do that is use, and also you need translators. Darn folks don't speak English, or don't speak French, eh? The best way to do that is you send your boys to live with the First Nations, and the First Nations send their boys to live in the communities. The French boys who got to live with the First Nations, they never came back. They discovered freedom and good life. But those are the guys that you hear about in the stories of like Etienne Goulet and the Courrier du Bois. Those are the fellows that are being sent to the First Nations communities to learn to speak the language and establish the relationships. Unfortunately, the boys who are sent the other direction, the First Nations boys that are sent to Quebec, this is where you find the origins and the very early beginnings of what becomes residential schools much later down the road. So you have these exchange relations. The French, and the British followed the model later, the French, there are two kinds of colonialism that we're talking about. The Puritan model is in New England, it's what's called settler colonialism. People actually want to move in, settle on the land, and occupy it. The folks in New France, it's called exploitative, what we call it exploitative colonialism. Exploitative colonialism. They're not that interested in settlement. And in fact, the fur trade companies resist the Crown's demand for settlement. They're interested in the fur trade and extracting as much fur for as much money as quickly as possible. Okay, so there are two different operations going on here, quite different. To do the fur trade, the French have to create alliances and links, and they basically tap into the First Nations trading networks that already existed. The French were quite happy to sit in Montreal, Tadoussac, and Quebec City. Just sit there and let the First Nations come to them. Bring the furs down every year, which they did. It worked just fine for about 80 years until a series of conflicts developed. And it's a long and very complicated and quite boring story. A series of conflicts developed over controlling those trade routes. Okay? And essentially what happened is you develop conflict between the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, and the Wendat, the Huron who were living in southern Ontario. The Wendat are the folks who are collecting the furs and funneling them into Quebec. And in, should we say, 1649, the Wendat get wiped out and entirely defeated. Now, in those trade networks, one of the requirements in those trade networks was the Wendat, in order to trade with the French, had to accept missionaries. No missionary, no trade. And there was another little rule, which is a really interesting one. In order to purchase a gun, and if you live in these hunting societies, guns are very useful. To purchase a gun, you have to be a Christian. All right, so there's an incentive. It's an incentivized system, all right, to become Christians. That in fact creates a huge amount of dissension and problem within the Wendat community and leads in 1649 to the entire collapse. What happens at that point, okay, and this is actually, what happens at that point is that the French realize they've got to get out of Montreal, Quebec, and Tadoussac and get out into the country themselves to collect the furs, because now the trade networks have been broken. And so the French actually get out and start moving out into the country. This is where you get the depots, the small winter camps which collect the furs, and I'm not going to press the point too hard. This is where you begin to get the origins of the Métis. Okay, it's living in those circumstances. What's going on in Europe the whole time all this is happening? War. There's all kinds of wars going on. Everybody, but I'm thinking more of the Protestant Reformation. All right. During this entire period, the struggles in Europe are around religion, they're around the Protestant Reformation.
And the Roman Catholic Counter-Reformation, out of which the Jesuits come.
Thank you. Which is absolutely true. And also, of course, leads to these various struggles and these various complexities, which is imported into North America. Okay? So you have a whole series of wars between the French and the British, and they have allies. Now, the alliances can be complicated, and maintaining those alliances is incredibly complicated. But they have allies with both the Haudenosaunee and the various Algonquin First Nations around that are more located around Quebec City at that time. The Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, are largely aligned with the English, largely, and the Algonquins are largely aligned with the French. And it tends to shift around a bit, but that's close. So that takes us into the early 1700s, and the other little point we need to make in here, of course, is that the British located in New England and New York by that time are really unable to get access to the fur trade. They can't punch through the French control of the trading networks. So the English do what the English do, and they try to do an end run around the French, which is they go into Hudson's Bay. All right, and hence the Hudson's Bay Company. And in fact, the English do precisely the same thing that the French do. They set up posts along the coast of Hudson's Bay, and they sit there and they wait for the First Nations to creep, to paddle down and bring the furs to them. They don't go inland. All right, they sit there and wait. I'll just tell you that the first inland trading post was a place called Henley House, that was established on the Albany River in, I think, 1720, around there. I was the first archaeologist to go look for Henley House. I never found it. I am a failed archaeologist. Completely failed. It turned out, by the way, it turned out that it was deliberately incorrectly marked on the Hudson's Bay Company map. It was not marked where the actual post was. It was marked about 2 miles away from where the post was. That was to fool people who were actually, if they got a hold of the map, like a certain archaeologist. Somebody else found Henley House. So the British tried to do an end run. Little statement, and this is very, very complicated when you think about it. Hudson's Bay Company is granted a charter by the King, all right, by the British Crown, a charter to trade. All right, it is given the exclusive right to trade. It is not given any rights in land. Okay, there is nothing in the charter. In fact, there is something in the charter that says if they acquire any land, they actually have to purchase it from the First Nations. Okay? But it does not give them rights in land. So you may wonder, just skipping ahead 100 or 200 years actually, skip ahead 200 years to when the Hudson's Bay Company sells to Canada. No, they can't sell the land because they don't own it. Thank you, yes. And that's, by the way, what the First Nations said. The First Nations, particularly in Treaty 6 negotiations, the First Nations said, how can they sell the land? They never owned it in the first place. So just a real interesting question, what was the Hudson's Bay Company doing and what did they sell to Canada? All right? It's a huge technical legal problem because they didn't actually gain the rights to the land. They gained exclusive rights to trade. All right? So,
Could this be a good place to
yes, it is.
stay tuned, you get the good answer after the break.
There is no answer. But that's
I I just thought there was a moment of suspense there.
Thank you. All right. Yes, we have come to 10 to 8. I was actually just noticing that, and you can go away and think about the Hudson's Bay Company and the last time you bought a Hudson's Bay Company blanket.